Du-Yun found his children covered in blood. Not blood, beet juice. But in that half second before his brain caught up to his eyes, before he registered the laughter, before he saw the woman on her back with his sons on top of her like she was the only safe place in the world in that half second, his heart stopped. The Persian rugs were gone. Industrial plastic covered his $40,000 floor. Karen Jameson wore yellow rubber gloves, the kind used for chemical spills, and she was teaching his silent, perfect children to scream. Enough. The word came out like a blade. The laughter severed. Both boys froze, then stepped behind Karen like a shield. Karen stayed down for 3 seconds, deliberate. When she stood, she peeled off one glove. Snap. You're home early, she said. Not a question. Du-Yun's shoes crunched through flour. Get them upstairs. Now. She pulled off the second glove. Snap. They aren't going anywhere until they finish the session. This is filth, he said. I hired you to stabilize them, not turn them into animals. Karen stepped forward, nearly his height. I'm teaching them how to fall. You've spent their lives teaching them to be perfect. I'm giving them the only thing your billions couldn't buy, which is the ability to survive you. Du-Yun's hands curled into fists. You're fired. Security will escort you to the gate. 30 minutes. Karen laughed, sharp and cold. She looked at the twins. Boys, go to the kitchen. Clean up. I'll be there in 5 minutes. Jihu's hand grabbed her shirt. Don't go, he whispered. I'm not going anywhere, Karen said, eyes locked on Du-Yun. Your father and I need to talk. The boys obeyed her. Not him, her, small feet padding across plastic to the kitchen door. Welcome to Velvet Noir. Before we watch Du-Yun's empire crack from the inside, subscribe and step into the shadows with us. This is where control meets chaos. The door closed. They stood alone. You just fired me, Karen said quietly. But they didn't run to you for protection. They obeyed me. Du-Yun stared at the wall behind her head. Finger paintings, dozens of them, taped over every camera lens. Crude crayon drawings, words in block letters. Daddy's watching. She'd censored him, used his son's artwork to blind his surveillance state. You can fire me, Karen said, stepping closer. But you'll explain to your sons why the only person who ever heard them laugh is gone. You'll watch them go back to silence. She paused. Or you accept that they're not your assets anymore, Du-Yun. They're children. And right now, they're my children, because I'm the one who taught them how to scream. Du-Yun's jaw tightened. He looked at the doorway, at the flower, at this woman who'd reprogrammed his perfect machine. Clean this up, he said, voice hollow. Tonight, Karen smiled. Not warm, not kind. No. I'm not your maid, I'm not your employee, and we both know I'm not someone you can fire. She walked to the doorway, paused without looking back. The boys and I will be having dinner at 7. You're welcome to join us. But if you do, you follow my rules. No silence, no perfection, just family. She left. Du-Yun stood alone, surrounded by plastic and flour and the echo of his son's laughter. On the wall, the finger paintings stared back. Stick figures holding hands. A woman in the center, taller than the rest. He hadn't walked into a trap. He'd walked into a hostage situation. And the hostages had already chosen their captor. Du-Yun didn't follow her to the kitchen. He stood in the wreckage, staring at the finger paintings like evidence in a crime he couldn't name. The stick figures held hands. The woman in the center towered over everyone else. He could hear them through the door. Not words, just the low murmur of Karen's voice, steady and calm, followed by the boys' lighter tones responding in that easy way they never used with him. Water running, cabinets opening. The ordinary sounds of a life he'd never bothered to build. When the kitchen door opened again, it wasn't Karen who emerged. It was Jihu, his face scrubbed clean, wearing fresh clothes. He stopped when he saw his father still standing there. We're making pasta, Jihu said finally, with the red sauce, the kind that gets everywhere. Du-Yun's throat felt tight. I see. Karen says you can help if you want, but you have to wash your hands first, and you can't yell if we spill. The boy waited, watching his father with those dark, intelligent eyes. Then he turned and walked back to the kitchen, leaving the door open behind him. An invitation, or a test. Du-Yun looked down at his hands, at the flower still dusting his $1,000 suit, at the plastic sheeting that had turned his museum into a playground. He thought about the surveillance suite 3 miles away, the monitors still dark, the control he'd spent years building now completely inverted. He walked to the kitchen. Karen stood at the stove, her back to him, stirring something in a copper pot that filled the air with garlic and tomato and basil. She didn't turn when he entered. The boys sat at the counter, Jiho carefully tearing basil leaves while Jihu watched the pasta water. "There's an apron on the hook," Karen said without looking. "If you're staying, you're working." The apron said, "Kiss the cook," in faded letters across the chest. Karen glanced at him, and for just a second, her mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. "Chop the garlic," she said, sliding a cutting board toward him. "Small pieces." Jiho giggled, actually giggled. The sound hit Do-yoon somewhere in his chest. He picked up the knife. For the next hour, Do-yoon learned what it meant to exist in controlled chaos. Flour on the counter, sauce splattering the backsplash. Jihu standing on a step stool, stirring the pot with intense concentration while Karen's hands hovered nearby, ready but not controlling. Jiho singing something off-key about pasta boats. Karen moved through the space like she owned it, correcting the boys with gentle firmness, teaching them the difference between al dente and overcooked, letting them make mistakes and fixing them together. When the pasta was finally ready, they sat at the kitchen island. Not the formal dining room, not the table that seated 20, the kitchen island with mismatched stools and paper napkins. Karen served the boys first, then herself. Then, finally, she slid a plate toward Do-yoon. "Thank you," he said quietly. She met his eyes for the first time since he'd entered. "You're welcome." They ate in near silence. But it wasn't the suffocating quiet of his usual dinners. It was the comfortable silence of people who'd worked together toward something. Jihu's foot bumped against Do-yoon's under the counter. The boy froze, expecting a reprimand. But Do-yoon just moved his leg slightly, making space. Karen noticed. She always noticed. When the boys finished, she sent them upstairs to wash up for bed, and suddenly it was just the two of them in the kitchen, surrounded by dirty pots and the lingering smell of garlic. Do-yoon stood. Started gathering plates. "Leave them," Karen said. "I don't leave messes." "I know. That's your whole problem." She leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You want to talk about what happens now? Or are we going to pretend that dinner fixed everything?" Do-yoon set the plates down. "You said I wasn't in control anymore." "You're not. Then what am I?" Karen studied him for a long moment. "You're at a crossroads, Do-yoon. You can fight me for them. Make this a war. Turn this house into a battlefield. Or you can accept that what they need isn't another general. It's a father." "And you?" His voice was quieter than he intended. "What are you in this equation?" She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm the one thing you can't buy, fire, or control. I'm the variable you didn't account for." She pushed off the counter, walked past him. "Lock up when you're done. The boys and I will see you at breakfast. 7 sharp. And Do-yoon," he turned, "wear something you don't mind getting dirty. We're painting tomorrow." She left him standing in the kitchen, surrounded by evidence of a life he'd never learned to live. And for the first time in years, Do-yoon didn't know his next move. The next morning, Do-yoon came downstairs in jeans. He'd owned them for 3 years and never worn them. They still had the store creases pressed into the denim. Karen looked up from the stove where she was flipping pancakes. Her eyes traveled from his designer jeans to his pristine white button-down and landed on his bare feet. He'd left off the shoes. That felt like enough of a concession. She said nothing, but her eyes held a challenge. The boys were already at the table, coloring, not on paper. On the industrial plastic she'd laid over the entire surface of his imported Italian dining table, the one that cost $40,000. "Good morning," Jiho said, without looking up from the blue dragon he was drawing with thick marker strokes. "Morning," Do-yoon replied, the word unfamiliar in his mouth at this hour. Karen slid a plate toward the empty seat. 3 pancakes, slightly burned around the edges. She'd made the pan too hot. They were imperfect. In his old life, he would have sent them back. In this new world, he sat down and picked up his fork. "We're going to paint the playroom today," Karen announced. The boys chose the colors, bright yellow and ocean blue. Do-yoon's playroom was currently a minimalist space in cream and taupe, designed by an award-winning architect. It had been photographed for Architectural Digest. "I see," he said. "Do you have a problem with that?" He met her eyes, held them. "No." The week that followed was a masterclass in psychological warfare disguised as domestic life. Do-yoon stayed home, telling his executive assistant he was working remotely. In reality, he was watching Karen systematically dismantle everything he'd spent years constructing. She taught the boys to climb the oak tree in the back garden. Do-yoon watched from his study window as Jihu reached for the first branch, his small face split by a grin so wide it looked almost painful. Karen stood below, arms ready but not reaching, letting him struggle, letting him succeed. When Jihu finally pulled himself onto the branch, he screamed. Not in fear, in triumph. She brought knives into the kitchen. Real ones. Do-yoon stood in the doorway, heart in his throat, as Jiho's small hands gripped the handle under Karen's steady guidance. Fingers curled back, like a claw, Karen murmured, her hand over the boy's hand. The knife does the work. You just guide it. If you hover, Karen said without turning around, they'll learn to be afraid. If you trust the process, they'll learn to be careful. Every lesson was a dare. Every moment a test. On the third night, Do-yoon found Karen's notebook. It was in the library, tucked between 2 volumes of Korean poetry he'd bought to impress a visiting minister, and never read. The leather cover was worn smooth, the pages filled with tight, efficient handwriting. He shouldn't have opened it, but his hands moved anyway. The first page was a timeline. His timeline. Every public appearance, every business trip, meticulously documented. But it wasn't a stalker's journal. It was a diagnostic chart. Subject exhibits hypervigilance, consistent with trauma response. Control mechanisms. Environmental manipulation. Staff management. Strict scheduling. Trigger points. Unexpected change. Loss of surveillance. Children's emotional expression. She'd been profiling him, studying him like a patient. He flipped through the pages. Observations about the boys, their sleep patterns, their anxiety responses. And then, near the middle, intervention protocol. Week 1. Establish safety without permission. Week 2. Introduce controlled chaos. Week 3. Force subject to participate or witness replacement. Subject. He was the subject. Find something interesting? Do-yoon turned. Karen stood in the doorway. She wasn't surprised. She'd left it there for him to find. You've been studying me, he said. I've been doing my job. Your job was to take care of my children. No. Karen walked into the room, took the notebook from his hands. My job was to take care of the children a man like you would create. That required understanding exactly what kind of trauma they were being subjected to. Trauma. The word felt like an accusation. Perfection is trauma, Do-yoon. Silence is trauma. Being raised as an investment portfolio instead of a human being is trauma. She closed the notebook. And you know it, because someone did the same thing to you. He turned away. You don't know anything about me. I know your mother's name is never mentioned in this house. I know you have a scar on your left wrist that you hide with expensive watches. I know you sleep 4 hours a night and check the security monitors every time you wake up. She paused. I know you're terrified you'll become whatever it was that made you this way. Do-yoon's hands curled into fists. Get out. No. He turned on her, and for a moment, the air between them crackled with something dangerous. This is my house. This is your museum. I'm turning it into their home. And if you want to be part of that home, you're going to have to learn to live in it. Karen stepped closer. Tomorrow morning, we're baking cookies. Messy, imperfect cookies. You're welcome to join us. Or you can go back to your office and monitor us from a safe distance. But you should know, Do-yoon, I've already won. The only question left is whether you want to be part of what comes next. She left him standing in the library, surrounded by books he'd never read and the ghost of a life he'd never learned to build. The following night, Jiho's fever spiked at 2 a.m. Do-yoon heard Karen's footsteps first quick, purposeful, the sound of someone who'd been woken by instinct rather than alarm. Then came the soft murmur of her voice in the boys' room, that low, steady tone she used when something was wrong but panic would only make it worse. He was already awake. He'd been sitting in his study with quarterly reports he wasn't reading, listening to the house breathe, the way he always did in the hours when sleep refused to come. By the time Do-yoon reached the nursery, Karen had Jiho wrapped in a lukewarm towel, his small body shaking with chills despite the fever burning through him. The thermometer on the nightstand read 104.2 inches, glowing red numbers that looked like a warning. We need to go to the hospital, Do-yoon said from the doorway. No. Karen's voice was calm, clinical, the voice of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. We need to bring the fever down here. Hospital means emergency room, waiting, fluorescent lights, being treated like a case number instead of a child. He stays here. He could have. I know what he could have. I spent 6 years in pediatric trauma. I know exactly what febrile seizures look like, what meningitis looks like, what every terrifying possibility looks like. This is a fever. A bad one. But it's just a fever. She looked up at him, and her eyes were hard. You can help or you can leave. But you don't get to second-guess me. Not about this. Do-yoon stayed. He pulled a chair to the side of Jiho's bed and sat down, feeling useless and oversized in the small room with its alphabet wallpaper and nightlight stars. For 6 hours, He watched Karen work. She was methodical, efficient, checking vitals every 15 minutes with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory. Temperature, pulse, respiratory rate, noted in a small journal she kept on the nightstand. She changed the lukewarm compress on Jiho's forehead, adjusted the blankets, spoke to the boy in that low, steady voice. "You're okay, baby. I know it feels bad. I know it's scary. But your body's fighting something and it's going to win. You just have to let it do its job." Jiho whimpered, his small hands clutching at Karen's arm. "I've got you," she murmured. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." Do-yoon watched her hands move competent, gentle, certain. Watched the way she checked Jiho's pupils with a penlight. The way she listened to his breathing. The way she never once showed fear, even though Do-yoon could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her fingers when she thought no one was looking. She was terrified. But she was functioning anyway. Around 3 a.m, Jiho woke up. The boy stood in the doorway in his pajamas, clutching his stuffed tiger, eyes wide and frightened. "Is Jiho dying?" he whispered. "No," Karen said firmly. "He has a fever. His body's fighting germs. He's going to be fine." Jiho didn't look convinced. He stood there, small and uncertain, and Do-yoon realized with a jolt that the boy was looking at him, waiting for him to do something, to provide reassurance, to be the parent. Do-yoon opened his arms. It wasn't conscious, wasn't planned. His body just moved, and then Jiho was climbing into his lap, settling against his chest like it was the most natural thing in the world. Do-yoon's arms came around his son, holding him carefully, like something breakable. "Karen's taking care of him," Do-yoon heard himself say. "She knows what she's doing. Jiho's going to be okay." Jiho nodded against his chest, his small body warm and trusting. They sat like that for the next 3 hours, Karen working, Jiho sleeping in Do-yoon's arms. Do-yoon, watching this woman fight to bring his son's fever down with nothing but cold compresses and medical knowledge and an absolutely unshakable certainty. At dawn, Jiho's temperature finally broke. The boy fell into real sleep, color returning to his cheeks, his breathing evening out into something peaceful. Karen sat back against the wall, exhausted. Her hair was tangled, her clothes rumpled, her eyes shadowed with the kind of tiredness that came from maintaining perfect control for hours on end. Do-yoon hadn't moved from the chair, hadn't checked his phone, hadn't left. Jiho was still asleep in his arms, heavy and warm and alive. "You can go now," Karen said quietly. "I know." He didn't move. Karen looked at him, really looked at him, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or respect, or the beginning of something neither of them had names for yet. "You were good with him," she said finally, nodding at Jiho. "When he was scared, you knew what to say. You taught me." Do-yoon's voice was rough from disuse. "By example, you always know what to say." "No, I don't. I just don't let them see when I'm terrified." She leaned her head back against the wall, closed her eyes. "I was scared out of my mind tonight. Fevers in children that young can turn bad fast. I kept thinking, what if I'm wrong? What if it's not just a virus? What if we should have gone to the hospital, but you didn't show it? No, because that's the job. You hold it together so they don't have to." Do-yoon looked down at Jiho, at this small person who trusted him enough to fall asleep in his arms, at the other bed where Jiho slept peacefully, fever broken, crisis past. "Thank you," he said, "for saving him." "I didn't save him. I just kept him comfortable while his body did the work." Karen opened her eyes, looked at Do-yoon with something that might have been softness. "But you're welcome." They sat in silence as the sun came up, painting the room in shades of gold and pink, and Do-yoon realized that somewhere in the past 6 hours, something fundamental had shifted. He wasn't watching Karen work anymore. He was working with her, and for the first time since she'd entered his life, Do-yoon felt like maybe, just maybe, he was on the right side of the war. 2 days after the fever broke, the investigator arrived on a Tuesday, dressed like a concerned child welfare agent, carrying a leather portfolio that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His name was Pak, and he'd been sent by Do-yoon's uncle, a man who'd spent 30 years circling the family empire like a shark, waiting for any sign of weakness he could exploit. Karen answered the door. She was wearing paint-stained overalls and had flour in her hair from the morning's baking session, but she looked at Pak with the kind of calm assessment that made him shift his weight from foot to foot. "Mr. Pak," she said, her voice pleasant but not warm. "Do-yoon mentioned you might stop by. Please, come in." Do-yoon hadn't mentioned anything, but Pak didn't know that. She led him to the sitting room, the formal one that Do-yoon never used. The one with the uncomfortable chairs and the art that was worth more than it was beautiful. Karen offered tea. Pack accepted, probably thinking this would be easy. A young nanny, clearly out of her depth, who would be intimidated by his authority and his carefully rehearsed concerns about the children's well-being. 10 minutes later, Do-Yun heard the front door close. He looked up from his laptop to see Pack walking quickly to his car, his face white, his hands shaking as he fumbled with his keys. Do-Yun found Karen in the kitchen, calmly making herself a cup of tea, as if she hadn't just sent a professional investigator running like a man who'd seen a ghost. "What did you say to him?" "I told him the truth." She poured hot water over green tea leaves, the motion precise and unhurried. "That I knew his daughter was in rehab for the 3rd time. Cocaine, mostly, with some prescription pills mixed in. That I knew about the embezzlement he'd covered up at his last firm, not the big one everyone knows about, the small one he thought no one noticed. $300,000 over 2 years, hidden in consulting fees to a company that doesn't exist." Do-Yun stared at her. "How did you—" "I told him I could read people the way he wished he could. That I could see every micro-expression, every tell, every tiny signal that broadcasts what someone's desperate to hide." She took a sip of tea, her eyes never leaving Do-Yun's face. "I told him I'd spent years in a trauma ward, learning to spot the difference between a parent who cares and a parent who wants to look like they care. Between someone who's genuinely concerned and someone who's fishing for leverage. And then? And then I told him that if he came back, if he filed any kind of report, if he so much as mentioned Do-Yun's name in connection with any investigation, I would make sure everyone in his life knew exactly who he was." Karen set down her teacup with a soft click. His wife, who thinks he's working late but doesn't know about the woman in accounting. His boss at the firm, his daughter's treatment facility, which would be very interested to know that he's been enabling her by paying off her debts. The Bar Association, which takes a dim view of embezzlement. She picked up the teacup again, took another sip. "I told him I could destroy his life in about 48 hours, and that I would do it with a smile on my face, because I've seen what men like him do to families when they're given the opportunity. I've watched them tear apart vulnerable people in the name of protecting them, when really they're just looking for something they can use." Do-Yun looked at this woman who'd invaded his perfect life and turned it into beautiful chaos. This woman who could read trauma in a child's posture and threats in an investigator's briefcase. This woman who'd just protected his family with the kind of ruthless efficiency he'd only ever seen in boardrooms. "You're dangerous," he said quietly, "only to people who threaten what's mine." Karen smiled, and there was nothing soft about it. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly how dangerous they were and had made peace with it. "Want to know what else I know?" "What?" She walked past him, close enough that he could smell tea and paint and the faint scent of her shampoo, something simple and clean that probably didn't cost $40 a bottle like everything else in his house. She paused at the doorway, looked back over her shoulder. "That you're falling in love with me, and it scares you more than anything your uncle could ever do." She left him standing in the kitchen, heart hammering against his ribs, unable to deny a single word, because she was right. She was always right. He'd spent 6 weeks watching her dismantle his life. 6 weeks watching her teach his sons to scream and climb and laugh. 6 weeks watching her move through his house like she owned it, marking it with flour and paint and the sound of children's joy. And somewhere in those 6 weeks, between the pasta dinners and the fever vigils and the moments when she looked at him like she could see straight through to the broken parts he'd spent his life hiding, he'd stopped seeing her as an employee. He'd started seeing her as the only person who'd ever made him want to be better than he was. That night, Do-Yun sat in his study and did something he'd never done before. He closed his laptop, put down his phone, turned off the security monitors, and he let himself imagine what it would be like to live in a house that wasn't a museum, to be a father instead of a curator, to let someone in, all the way in, past the walls and the surveillance and the carefully constructed barriers. It was terrifying, but for the first time in his life, Do-Yun thought maybe it was worth being terrified. It happened on a Sunday, 3 weeks after Jiho's fever. Do-Yun found Karen in the foyer, coat on, overnight bag in hand. She wasn't sneaking out, wasn't running. She was standing in full view of the security cameras he'd quietly reactivated, car keys in her hand, testing him one more time. "Where are you going?" "Out. The boys are napping. Mrs. Chen is here. You're perfectly capable of watching them for 2 hours without constant supervision." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but her eyes held a challenge. "That's not what I—" He stopped, tried again. "What I meant was, where are you going? I'd like to know. Would you?" It wasn't a question. "And if I said it was none of your business, then I'd respect that. But I'd still want to know, Karen studied him for a long moment, her hand tightening on the bag strap. I have a life outside this house, Do-yoon. Friends I haven't seen in weeks. A gym membership I'm still paying for but haven't used in 2 months. A storage unit with furniture I haven't looked at since I moved in here. I go out sometimes, try to remember what it's like to exist in spaces that don't smell like finger paint and your very expensive cologne. I don't wear cologne. Yes, you do. It's subtle, probably costs more than my car payment, and it's driving me insane. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder. I need space. I need to not be the person who holds this family together for one afternoon. I need to remember who I am when I'm not performing miracles in your museum. Do-yoon moved before he'd made the conscious decision to move. One hand on the door frame beside her head, his body blocking her exit without touching her. Not trapping, just close enough to smell her shampoo and see the way her pulse jumped at her throat. Don't go, he said. That's not how this works. I know I don't get to give you orders. I know I don't get to control where you go or who you see or how you spend your time when you're not with my children. His voice was low, rough with something he couldn't name. But I'm asking, please, don't go. Why not? Because I don't know how to do this without you. Do what? Any of it. Be their father. Live in this house. Exist in a space that isn't perfectly controlled. He was close enough now that he could see the gold flecks in her eyes, the way her chest rose and fell with each breath. You think I don't know what you're doing? You think I don't see how you've systematically destroyed everything I built? I didn't destroy it, Karen said, her voice steady even though he could see her hands trembling slightly. I showed you it was already broken. You've ruined my life. No, I've given you one. The kiss wasn't planned, wasn't gentle. It was 6 weeks of tension snapping like a wire pulled too tight. Do-yoon's hands in her hair, tangling in the strands that still smelled like paint and flour. Karen's fingers gripping his shirt, pulling him closer even as she gasped against his mouth. The bag dropping to the marble floor with a soft thud. The door forgotten. The cameras forgotten. Everything forgotten except the taste of her and the feeling of finally letting go. Karen pulled back first, breathing hard, her eyes wide and dark and something that looked like afraid. No, she said. No? I won't be another thing you collect, Do-yoon. Another asset in your portfolio. Another beautiful object in your museum that you control and monitor and keep perfectly preserved behind glass. She pushed at his chest, and he stepped back immediately, giving her space even though everything in him wanted to pull her closer. If you want me, you have to let me be free. You have to trust me enough to walk out that door and come back because I choose to. Not because you've made it impossible for me to leave. Karen, I'm serious. You want me? You have to let me hold the key. You have to give me the power to leave and trust that I won't use it. Because that's what love is. Do-yoon. It's not control. It's not surveillance. It's standing in front of someone with no walls, no insurance policies, no backup plans, and saying, this is me, and I trust you not to destroy me. She picked up her bag, walked to the door, put her hand on the handle. I'll be back in 2 hours. The boys will wake up in 30 minutes. They'll want a snack, cheese, and crackers. Nothing fancy. Ji-hoo has been asking about the treehouse. Maybe you could show him the plans you've been secretly drawing up in your study, the ones you think I don't know about. She paused with the door half open, looked back at him. I'm coming back, Do-yoon. Because I choose to. Not because you've made it impossible for me to leave. Learn the difference. She walked out. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like finality. Do-yoon stood in the foyer, heart hammering, hands shaking, feeling like every wall he'd ever built had just collapsed around him. He could see himself in the hallway mirror disheveled, lost, his carefully constructed control completely shattered. And for the first time in his life, he didn't try to rebuild it. He let the walls fall. He let himself stand there in the ruins of his perfect control and feel everything he'd spent decades trying to avoid. The fear, the vulnerability, the terrifying possibility that loving someone meant giving them the power to destroy you. And then he went upstairs to check on his sons, because that's what fathers did, even broken ones. For 3 days, the house felt like a battlefield after the war was over, scarred but standing, uncertain but breathing. Karen came back from her 2 hours away. She made dinner. She read bedtime stories. She corrected the boys' homework and taught them a new card game and painted with them in the playroom. But when Do-yoon entered a room, she found a reason to leave. He'd kissed her. She'd kissed him back. And then she'd walked out the door and come back exactly 2 hours later, as promised. Now neither of them knew how to exist in the space between what had happened and what came next. On the 4th day, Do-yoon found himself in his office, staring at a tablet he rarely touched. the master control for every lock, camera, and gate on the estate, his insurance policy, his final line of defense against a world that felt increasingly out of his control. He'd had it made 3 years ago, against the explicit advice of his lawyers. They'd said consolidating all that power in one device was insanity, a single point of failure that could destroy him if it fell into the wrong hands. They'd recommended distributed systems, multiple fail-safes, layers of redundancy. But Do-yoon hadn't cared about their recommendations. He'd needed to know he had it. The final word, the ultimate override. The thing that meant no matter what happened, no matter who tried to take something from him, he could never truly lose control. Now he held it in his hands and felt its weight like an anchor dragging him down. Ji-hoo appeared in the doorway, wearing mismatched socks, and the serious expression he got when he was trying to solve a problem too big for his age. "Karen's crying," the boy said quietly. Do-yoon looked up. "What?" "In her room. I heard her through the door." Ji-hoo's face was solemn, older than his 4 years. "Did you make her cry?" "I don't know. Maybe. Probably. You should fix it." The boy walked further into the room, stopped in front of Do-yoon's desk. "She fixes everything for us. When we're sad, when we're scared, when we make mistakes, she always fixes it. She should get fixed too." Do-yoon felt something crack in his chest. "It's not that simple, Ji-hoo. Why not?" "Because fixing things with people is different than fixing broken toys. Sometimes you can't just glue the pieces back together. Karen says when something's really broken, you don't glue it back the same way. You make something new with the pieces." Ji-hoo looked at the tablet in Do-yoon's hands. "Is that your phone?" "No, it's something more important. More important than a phone?" "What does it do?" Do-yoon looked at the device, then at his son. "It controls everything in the house. All the locks, all the cameras, all the gates. With this, I can see everything, control everything, make sure nothing bad happens." "Oh," Ji-hoo thought about this. "Does it make Karen stop crying?" "No. Then maybe it's not as important as you think." The boy left, trailing one hand along the wall the way he always did, and Do-yoon sat with those words echoing in his head. Maybe it's not as important as you think. He thought about Karen's notebook, about her observation that he exhibited hypervigilance consistent with trauma response, that his need for control stemmed from childhood loss of agency. She was right. She was always right. His mother had been the first person to teach him that love came with conditions, with requirements, with the constant threat of withdrawal if he didn't perform perfectly enough, if he didn't meet every expectation, if he showed any sign of weakness or need. So he'd built a life where nothing could be withdrawn, where he controlled every variable, where love wasn't necessary because possession was enough, where surveillance replaced trust and contracts replaced connection. And then Karen had walked in and exposed it all for what it was, a prison he'd built for himself, decorated with expensive things and empty rooms. She'd shown him that his sons weren't possessions to be managed, that his house wasn't a fortress to be defended, that the life he'd built was just a very expensive way of hiding from the one thing he'd always been afraid of: being seen, being known, being loved not for what he could provide or control, but for who he was underneath all of it. Do-yoon stood up, took the tablet, walked downstairs and out the front door, across the driveway to where Karen's car was parked. He left the tablet on her driver's seat with a note written on the back of a business card in his precise handwriting. "You were right. I've been falling in love with you. And yes, it terrifies me more than anything, but not as much as the thought of losing you because I was too afraid to let go. This has every password, every security code, every way to lock me out or let me in. You could destroy me with this, bankrupt me, expose me, take everything. I'm giving it to you anyway, because you taught me that love isn't about control. It's about trust. Die." He walked back inside, sat in the living room, and waited to see if she'd understand what he was really saying, that he was choosing her, choosing trust, choosing the terrifying possibility of being completely vulnerable, choosing love. 20 minutes later, Karen came downstairs. She had the tablet in her hands and tears still wet on her cheeks. She stood in the doorway of the living room, looking at Do-yoon with an expression he couldn't read, something between wonder and terror, and something that might have been hope. "This is insane," she said, her voice hoarse. "I know. You're giving me access to everything. Your security system, your financial accounts, your private files, your entire life." She held up the tablet like it was evidence in a trial. "I could ruin you. I could lock you out of your own house. I could drain your accounts. I could send everything to the press. I could destroy you. You could. So why would you do this?" Do-yoon stood up slowly, walked toward her until they were close enough to touch, but didn't. Not yet. He needed her to hear this first, because 6 weeks ago, you walked into my life and called me a subject. You studied me like I was a case file. You documented every trauma response, every control mechanism, every way I'd failed my children without meaning to. He paused, his throat tight. And you were right about all of it. Do-yoon. No, let me finish. His hands were shaking, so he shoved them in his pockets. You said I needed to choose whether I wanted to keep being the subject of my own trauma or be the author of a different story. I'm choosing. Right now, I'm choosing to trust you, to give you the power to destroy me completely, and believe that you won't. Why? Because that's what you asked for. You said if I wanted you, I had to let you hold the key. You had to be free to leave, and trust that you'd choose to stay. He pulled his hands from his pockets, held them out, open and empty and trembling. So here's the key. Here's all of it. Everything I've spent my life protecting. Every wall I've built. Every defense mechanism. Every way I've tried to control the world so it couldn't hurt me. And I'm standing here with no walls, no weapons, no backup plans. And I'm saying, this is me. All of me. Even the broken parts. Especially the broken parts. Karen's eyes were bright with tears that hadn't fallen yet. You don't know what you're asking. Yes, I do. I'm asking you to stay. Not because I've made it impossible for you to leave. Not because you feel obligated to my children. But because you want to. Because you choose this. Choose us. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. Choose me. Even though I'm a disaster who doesn't know how to be human without a manual. You're not a disaster. I'm a man who built a museum instead of a home. Who raised his children like investments instead of people. Who needed a stranger to teach him how to hold his own son without flinching. His voice cracked. I'm a disaster, Karen. But I'm trying to be less of one, and I can't do it without you. Karen set the tablet down on the side table with a soft click. Walked up to him until they were close enough that he could count her heartbeats. You really don't wear cologne? The question was so unexpected that Do-yoon almost laughed. What? Earlier. I said you wear cologne. You said you don't. I don't. I think you're smelling the laundry detergent, Mrs. Chen uses. It's imported from Seoul. Costs $40 a bottle. Of course it does. Karen reached up, touched his face with fingers that were still slightly damp from her tears. You're absurd. You know that? You own a house that costs more than some countries' GDP. Your laundry detergent costs $40. You probably have shoes worth more than my car. 3 pairs, actually. But I'm trying to be less absurd. Don't. She smiled through her tears. Don't change that. Change the walls. Change the control. Change the fear. But don't change the fact that you care about things deeply. Even if the things you care about are sometimes ridiculous. That's not absurd. That's just you. She kissed him. Soft this time. Like a promise instead of a collision. Like the beginning of something rather than the end. I'm not taking the tablet, she said against his mouth. What? I'm giving it back to you. Because I don't want power over you, Do-yoon. I want partnership with you. I want us to both be free to leave, and both choose to stay. Every day. Not because we're trapped. But because we're choosing this. She pressed the tablet back into his hands, her fingers warm against his. The house is no longer a museum, Do-yoon said quietly, the words feeling like a vow. It's a home, and you're the one with the authority to run it. No, we run it, together. Messy and imperfect and sometimes completely chaotic. She smiled, and it was the first real smile he'd seen from her in days, but together. Through the window, they could see the boys in the backyard. Ji-hoo was climbing the oak tree, higher than he'd ever gone before. Ji-ho was drawing on the driveway with sidewalk chalk, creating what looked like a dragon eating a very small businessman in a very expensive suit. The museum had stopped. Life had begun, and for the first time in his life, Do-yoon wasn't afraid of it. 6 months later, the great room was unrecognizable. The Persian rugs were still there, 16th century artifacts worth $250,000 each, but now they were covered with industrial plastic during art sessions, and the plastic was covered with paint splatters in every color imaginable. The walls held finger paintings in expensive frames, hung right next to the Rothko in the hallway, and Do-yoon had stopped trying to explain to visitors which pieces were real art, because they all were, in the ways that mattered. The silence was gone, replaced with laughter and arguments and the sound of Ji-hoo teaching Ji-ho a complicated handshake they'd learned at school. Replaced with Karen singing off-key while she cooked, her voice echoing through rooms that had spent years muffled in quiet. Replaced with the beautiful, chaotic noise of an actual family learning how to be one. Do-yoon still worked too much. Old habits were hard to break, and there were days when he found himself reaching for his phone to check the security monitors before remembering he'd disabled most of them, keeping only the ones at the perimeter because Karen had said that was a reasonable compromise between security and paranoia. Karen still pushed boundaries, still left flour on the counters and paint on the walls and challenged him every time he tried to fall back into old patterns of control. Still looked at him sometimes with that clinical assessment that reminded him she saw straight through every defense he tried to raise. The boys still tested both of them daily, learning exactly how far they could push before Karen's voice got that particular tone that meant someone was about to lose television privileges, or before Do-yoon's eyebrow did that particular arch that meant it was time to reconsider their life choices. But every Sunday, without fail, they made pasta together. All four of them crowded into the kitchen that had once been the domain of a professional chef who came in 3 times a week. And Do-yoon wore the Kiss the Cook apron without irony, because Jiho had added to it with fabric markers, drawing a family of stick figures across the chest. One evening, after the boys were in bed after the story time and the tucking in and the 3 glasses of water Jiho always needed before he could actually settle down, and the reassurance to Jiho that yes, tomorrow they would work on the treehouse, and no, Daddy wasn't going to suddenly decide treehouses were too dangerous and cancel the project. Karen found Do-yoon in the library. He was sitting in the leather chair by the window, holding her old notebook, the one she'd used to profile him in those first weeks, the one that had documented all his trauma responses and control mechanisms and failures as a father. Second thoughts? Karen asked from the doorway, her voice soft. No, just understanding. He closed the notebook carefully, running his fingers over the worn leather cover. You wrote that perfection is trauma, that silence is trauma, that being raised as an investment portfolio instead of a human being is trauma. He looked up at her. I'm starting to think maybe imperfection is healing. Maybe noise is healing. Maybe mess is healing. Starting to think? She smiled, walking into the room. After 6 months, I'm new at this. Give me time. You've got time. Karen curled into the chair beside him, fitting herself against his side in that way she had, like they were 2 pieces of the same broken thing that had finally found each other. Lots of it. Outside, rain started to fall, soft and steady against the windows, the kind of rain that meant the boys would want to jump in puddles tomorrow and Do-yoon would have to resist the urge to tell them no. They'd get dirty, they'd catch cold, all the things his own mother had said to him. The kind of rain that meant Karen would say, yes, go ahead, that's what washing machines are for. And he'd stand on the porch watching his son scream with joy in the downpour and realize all over again what he'd almost missed. Do-yoon? Thank you. For what? For letting me destroy your museum. He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and paint, and the faint smell of the garlic they'd used for dinner. Thank you for showing me how to build a home. In the silence that followed, the comfortable silence of 2 people who'd fought their way to peace, through flower fights and fever vigils and 1,000 small surrenders, Do-yoon thought about something he'd read, once, back when he was still trying to understand why his perfectly controlled life felt so empty. James Baldwin had written, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Do-yoon had spent his entire life refusing to face himself, refusing to look at the trauma that had shaped him, the fear that had driven him, the loneliness that had made him build walls so high even he couldn't see over them anymore. Karen had forced him to look, had held up a mirror and said, "This is what you are. This is what you've done. This is what you could become, if you're brave enough." And what he'd found wasn't perfection or control or any of the things he'd built his empire on. It was humanity. Messy, imperfect, beautiful, terrifying humanity. He'd found a woman who saw him completely, every broken part, every trauma response, every way he'd learned to survive by never really living and loved him anyway. Had found sons who were learning to scream and climb and be loud and messy and joyful, who would never have to build the kinds of walls he had found a home that wasn't a museum, but a place where real people lived real lives and made real mistakes and loved each other through all of it. He'd found himself, and it was better than anything he'd ever controlled. If you've stayed with us through Do-yoon's transformation, through Karen's revolution, through 2 small boys learning to scream again, if you've felt the weight of control giving way to trust, if you've recognized yourself in the man who built walls instead of bridges, if you've ever wondered what it would be like to hand someone the master key to your entire life and trust them not to destroy you, we want to hear from you. What would you do if someone saw all your broken parts and loved you anyway? Would you let them in? Would you give them the power to leave, and trust that they'd choose to stay? Leave a comment below. Tell us your story. And subscribe to Velvet Noir for your next dark escape into stories where love isn't about perfection. It's about being brave enough to be real. Where control meets chaos. Where museums become homes. Where the most terrifying thing you can do is trust someone else with your whole, imperfect, beautiful heart. Until next time, stay in the shadows. Where broken things learn to be whole, we'll be waiting.